I wanted to talk about Scott Ritter. I don't like to talk about Scott Ritter, but I gotta talk about Scott Ritter because he is particularly humiliating himself as of recent. So for those of you who don't know, Scott Ritter is a former UN weapons inspector that was disgraced after, I think it was early to mid 2000s. He was found trying to interact with what he thought was an underage girl, was actually a police officer doing a sting operation, and he started sending them images of his ding-a-ling under the idea of he wanted to have an underage girl look at his private car. And now, thankfully, at the other end of that interaction was a police officer. Well, I guess unthankfully for the police officer, sucks for them. Or maybe, you know, give them Purple Heart or something. Trials and tribulations. But a little girl was not, and he was caught. Now, I know some of the details of the story that I'll share in a little bit, but that's what happened. To be clear, that didn't happen only once. This happened twice. Technically, and I'm just talking about two separate court cases, we could actually say 3 times, because on one occasion he did it, but he wasn't enough to put him behind bars or anything. Did it again, and that's when they got him. So we got like 3 times in total he tried to do this, 2 of which ended up in court cases, which eventually led to him being convicted as a sex offender and being put in prison because he tried to diddle underage girls. Something you not do if you want to stay out of prison. Now, the thing is about Russia is where you would see that as a reason to stay away from someone like Scott Ritter, the Russians took the opposite approach and saw it as a reason to approach Scott Ritter. Now, they didn't approach him literally under the auspices of, hey, I saw that you tried to do that thing with an underage girl. I guess you don't got any options. Go with us, and said that directly. But I do think that there is a certain level of, and I've noticed this, of loser recruitment syndrome or something, whatever you want to call it, where Russia is going to the people who couldn't succeed in traditional media, pick them up, take them in, give them higher pay on average than what they would get in the media circuits they're working in at this stage, or taking people who are no longer able to work in the United States due to them being ostracized, either for being criminals or doing extremely immoral things, or in this case, both. And so Scott Ritter, having no options to really work in the American media circuit anymore because he's, again, a twice convicted sex offender who tried to diddle kids, maybe, and I've seen this not only in Russia, but I've seen people try to get new lives in Ukraine and other countries as well. Maybe he could get a new life working for the Russians, because the Russians just want American mouthpieces spouting off their nonsense, spouting off their propaganda, and if they can make it a former UN weapons inspector, try to add some prestige to his name while ignoring, you know, the less prestigious aspects of things he's done, then it could be to benefit for the Russian government. And so the Russian government snatched him up, and they've been using him to peddle Russian government propaganda ever since. Whether it's him going on George Galloway's show or going on any number of programs like Jackson Hinkle's in order to advocate on behalf of the Russians and say, oh, Ukraine can't win, Russia's great, Russia's great, Russia's great. Whether it is him going to Chechnya and giving speeches to Chechen soldiers, telling them what they're doing is fantastic and all the people of the world fear the Chechen, etc. His job has been to carry their water. But the problem is, you can't change the truth. And the truth is that he tried to diddle kids. And so when Scott Ritter came to the United States recently, he was stopped by United States law enforcement, and they seized his passport. And the reason why they seized his passport is in the United States, they have, you know what, actually, let's leave it there. I will tell you in a moment why they seized his passport. But let's listen to Scott Ritter's version of events before I tell you why they actually seized his passport.
Ritter.
Here's him on with this #1 name in Russian state TV.
Well, it's definitely not morning.
Не совсем
It's
доброе.
definitely not morning. It's night in the U.S. Anyway, Scott, I am terribly sorry.
В любом случае.
terribly sorry that we
Скотт,
won't be able to
я
see you
очень
in St.
расстроен,
that we
что мы
won't
не
be able
сможем
to
увидеть
see
вас в
you in St.
Санкт-Петербурге.
Petersburg. It is quite weird.
So you
Но
were
это довольно
stopped
странно.
So you were stopped by
Вас
the
остановили?
police?
by police
Вас остановила
and you
полиция,
ordered to give
And you
up
were
your
ordered to
passport,
give
и
up
вам
your
приказали отдать ваш
passport?
паспорт,
to give up your
To give up your
citizenship.
citizenship?
отдать ваше гражданство.
You were
Were you
subpoenaed.
subpoenaed?
Вас вызвали в
Legally
суд или
wise,
что произошло?
what was it?
What was it?
Юридически, что это было? Как это выглядело?
Mind you, you could just Google this. He doesn't need Scott to tell him. It's freely accessible information.
We don't know.
We don't
Мы не
know.
I was stopped by three members
Меня остановило
Of Customs and Border
3
Police, the
человека
border guard,
таможенной полиции,
right before
охраны,
I boarded the Turkish
прежде
Airlines
чем
flight.
я был
That
готов
would have
сесть
taken me
на
to St. Petersburg.
рейс турецких
They
авиалиний,
asked, "Are you Scott Ritter?"
отправиться в
I
Санкт-Петербург.
said,
Они спросили,
yes.
меня зовут Скотт Ritter, да. Я передал свой паспорт.
I gave them my
Сказали,
passport, and they said
что
you're
они
operating under orders of the
действуют
U.S. State Department to seize my
в
passport.
рамках
I said, "Is there a
приказа
reason?" And they said,
Госдепартамента
"No,
США.
they don't
И
have a
они должны
reason."
забрать мой паспорт. Я
I
спросил,
said,
есть
"What am I
какая-то причина?
supposed
Они
to
сказали,
do?"
нет, причин никаких нет. И что я должен
They
делать
said you can
после
maybe
этого?
contact the State
Возможно, я
Department.
должен связаться с
They had no contact
Госдепартаментом,
info.
но у них не было никакого контакта.
They were
и
just
просто
told to
приказали
take my
забрать мой
passport.
паспорт. И дальше разговора никакого не
That was
было.
the end of the conversation.
Затем
They brought me back
они
from the
меня проводили
aircraft,
из аэропорта
escorted me out of the
и
airport, and let
просто
me
отпустили
go.
меня.
There was no charge. They just took my passport
Ни обвинений никаких, ничего юридического не было. Они просто взяли мой паспорт
and denied me the ability to leave the country
и не позволили
and
мне
attend the St. Petersburg Economic
уехать
Forum.
из
Oh,
страны
too
посетить
bad.
ПМФ. Что они сделали?
What they
Это
did was
было
extraordinary.
экстраординарные меры. Они нарушили закон.
Sure, it's a
Я
violation of the
уверен, что они
law.
нарушили закон.
This was so disruptive to many
Это
people
на самом деле подрывает
who paid for the trips, the hotels that were
обычных
reserved.
людей.
Dozens of people were
резерв
working with me.
от-
I'm very sorry to the Russian government who paid for your trip.
отеля.
Dozens of
Билеты.
people who were working with me to
Люди,
make
которые
this trip a
работают со мной,
success.
которые готовили эту
I think this was part of the message.
поездку. Это как раз-таки была часть того посыла.
That Scott Ritter doesn't get to
Скотт Риттер не
travel to
должен
Russia
отправляться в Россию,
without having problems.
и ему необходимо
The
создать
problems would
проблемы.
not just
А
be for
проблемы
Scott
будут не
Ritter,
только в отношении Скотта
but the
Риттера и
Russians
русских,
who are
которые
working
работают с
Anyway, that's the way he retells events. Now, what actually is occurring here is in the United States, if you are a registered sex offender, particularly, I think also applies to if you're a sex offender in relation to children, you have to get your passport stamped that you're a sex offender. That you need to carry that label with you everywhere you go and travel. Now, he doesn't really talk about that part on state TV much, and I think it's probably because reminding everyone on every occasion he can that he's a sex offender is not his top priority. But the reason they do that is because if you're a pedo and you're going to another country and that country doesn't know you're that, well, that could lead to problems if you start, skipping by the local, I don't know what country he'd be in. If you're in Sri Lanka, right, as Scott Ritter, and then you start noticing him outside of little Sri Lankan kindergartens, I think for obvious reasons that would be a problem. And so that's why they have it's to warn people. It's to warn people that, quite frankly, Scott Ritter is a danger to children. Now, I think that it's not a bad thing that we warn other countries if we're going to allow these types of people to travel across the world, what they are, so they can look out for it. He says it's to humiliate him, even though that's not what he's saying here. He doesn't talk about it here. But I wanted to show you who was ready to get into the trenches and listen to Scott Ritter's story, to listen to his tale of woe about him being a persecuted kitty diddler. That, of course, is Jimmy Dore. This is Scott Ritter on Jimmy Dore's podcast describing how he committed no crime because there is no victim. Remember when he was messaging police officer? Since it wasn't an actual little girl, in his mind. Therefore, it isn't a crime and he should be let go, and all legal theory points.
I committed no crime. Not a single. There is no victim. There is no victim. It's a cop who registered as an adult and then later said that he was a 15-year-old girl. There's no victim. There was no contact. There was nothing. This would have been thrown out of every court in the world except the one that I was in, because they had a hard-on for putting Scott Ritter, the former UN weapons inspector, in jail.
Well, no, I think the problem was that Scott Ritter had the hard-on. I think that's the problem, which actually the investigator, the police officer, got to see because he tried to show his genitalia to what he believed was a 15-year-old girl. And intent does matter when it comes to crime. If, for example, let's say I was married to a lovely wife, femboy, manly man, whatever you imagine me to be married to, headcanon one day, and I come home and I open the door, and let's say that I snuck out that night and I stuffed my pillows into the bed sheets to trick them to think I was still there. And I come in, I open the door, and I see them stabbing the pillows before reacting in shock as feathers go up, and they turn to me to see that I'm very much still alive. Attempted murder is still a crime. Just because I'm not dead doesn't mean that no crime was committed. If they were trying to murder me, that's murder. If you were trying to diddle kids, even if you thought that that police officer was a kid but they weren't really, that's still a crime. That is still a crime. Like if under and I wish I could claim this, but the person who brought this to my attention, post Left Watch, posted, I think, the best defense, or this is the argument Scott Ritter's using, just in shorter terms.
I want to set the record straight. I thought the cop was a prostitute.
It's brilliant. It's a brilliant defense. Why has nobody ever thought of it before? Why has no one ever thought of it before? Can I also point out to this in this segment how soulless Jimmy Dore looks? Now, I'm not a big Jimmy Dore fan. I don't like Jimmy Dore, quite frankly, at all. He looks soulless. Can we just, like, in silence, just look at Jimmy Dore's eyes? Look at they're sunken. He's looking at the ground. He's like faded. He either popped like 5 gummies before the stream today, or he's slowly realizing on stream, oh my God, he is a pedo. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. But if he did have that realization, that did not stop him from continuing to host Scott Ritter as he went on to not only defend his attempt to diddle what he thought was a 15-year-old girl, he then went on to paint himself as a bad boy in prison. So when he was, in his mind, politically persecuted, and he went to prison for doing what he tried to do, he says that he was like a hard gangster. And in prison, he went up to the Crips and the Bloods and the Latin Kings, and he got them straight. And they were like, hey, man, we found out you were a pedo. You want to do this to kids? He's like, nah, man, here's the paperwork. And then the Latin King said, oh, cool, we believe you.
As a sex offender. You know what they do to sex offenders in prison, Jimmy? It ain't an easy ride. Guess what happened to me? I went, the guards told me when I came in, don't talk about your case. Well, hell, it was all over TV. So I went straight to the gangs. I went to the Crips, the Bloods, and the Latin Kings, the big 3 that kill sex offenders. And I went up to them and I put all my paperwork on the table and I said, read it. If you guys think I'm a sex offender, we'll go out right now and I'll kill about 50 of you before you get me. But if that's what you want to do, let's do it. They read it and they came back and they said, you're screwed. You got screwed. There's no crime here. In order to get out of prison, you have to take sex offender therapy. But in order to do this, you have to plead guilty. I went to the head and I said, I'm not pleading guilty. I didn't commit a crime. I'm guilty of nothing. He said, well, then you'll never get out on parole. I said, that's too bad. What I did say is I put the file in front of him and said, everything in there I'm guilty of, but none of it is a crime. Guess what happened, Jimmy? I'm the only sex offender ever to be paroled from Pennsylvania State Prison without ever confessing his crime, because even they said you committed no crime. The warden said
getting paroled does not mean they said you didn't commit a crime. That just means you could have been let out for good behavior. It could mean any number of things that you got parole. But there's tons of like gangbangers and stuff that really did go kill people or hurt people or do bad things that get paroled. And they didn't get paroled because the government said, oh, no, it's because like they think that they have a reason to believe that you will not recommit the crime. Now, in Scott Ritter's case, he actually got caught doing this like 2 to 3 times. So I don't know if parole was actually the smart move, but I mean, as far as we know, he hasn't tried to do it a fourth or third or fourth time. It depends on whether you count first attempt that they weren't able to gather enough evidence to get.
Said you committed no crime. The guard said you committed no crime. The judge and the prosecutor who wanted to make a name off of putting me in jail, they said I did. That's the result.
So his story is that he went into prison and then went to the Crips, the Latin Kings, and the Bloods. I guess he called like a 3-way gang meeting because Scott Ritter just has so much influence. And then he went to them and said, listen here, guys, I'm Scott Ritter and I'm going to beat up so many of you. But if you want, you can read my 300 pages of legal case filings to find out that I'm not really a sex offender. Because when I was messaging what I thought was a 15-year-old girl, it was actually a cop. And then the Latin Kings and the Crips and the Bloods all sat down and read some 300 pages of case filings, because I guess they're all legal scholars. And they came back and said, oh, Mr. Scott, we were certainly befuddled by the legal circumstances in this inquiry that the government has made into your personal, let's just say, unpleasantness in the bedroom. We do think this is completely uncouth. And sir, not only will we not bother you, let's make you an honorary Crip and Blood. Let's make you the king of Blood Town. This never happened. None of this ever happened. He did not go up to the Latin Kings, the Bloods, and the Crips and threaten them. He did not go up to them and say, read my case filings. And they certainly didn't then go and actually read it and then say, oh, never mind. You only thought it was a little girl. It wasn't actually a little girl. It's ridiculous. This is silly. And the fact that Jimmy Dore is sitting there like nodding and smiling and he's not pushing back on anything, it shows how weak journalist he is. He's not only a weak journalist, but a weak man. He's a weak man. If somebody's saying this to you in front of you and you're just like staring off into the distance, he knows what's up. You could see it in his eyes. He knows what's up. But he just does nothing. He doesn't push back because Scott Ritter's in his camp. He doesn't like the Ukrainians. He's in his camp. So you just kind of sit there and you let it happen. Just like on Jackson Hinkle show, just like the rest of these show. They just got to ignore the fact that he's a sex offender and he wants to diddle kids. And if they can ignore that, then they can use his credibility from being a former UN weapons inspector to reach their ends, to try to find some audience, find some credibility that they can take advantage of. I do want to add one more piece of information, and that is we should not be too mean. I really mean that. We should not be too mean to Scott Ritter. We need to be nice to Scott Ritter. The reason why is if you actually go back, you read the case files, because I don't think the Latin Kings did, but I did. I read much more than I should have, honestly. One of his defenses as to why he did what he did was not only that he thought that this 15-year-old claimed girl was role-playing as a prostitute, which makes no sense. Why would a prostitute tell you that they're 15? It makes no sense. But also that he was engaging in this behavior because he was bullied. Because he stood up to the Bush government and was against the Iraq War. And he got so much criticism and attacks from opposing the Iraq War, it pushed him to diddle. So really, when you think about it, it was Bush and Cheney that made him try to diddle those kids. It wasn't his fault. It's all the foot of Rumsfeld Rumsfeld at the end. So guys, don't critique him too hard, because you know, if he ever goes over to Russia, you know, I'm not a big fan of the Russian government right now, but I do not believe that the Russian children should have to suffer Scott Ritter, just like the American children shouldn't have to suffer Scott Ritter. Children are innocent, and that's why you should keep them far, far away from Scott Ritter. But that won't stop all of the English-speaking Russophile accounts going out there to praise the Russian government and praise what they're doing in Ukraine and make them look good, using Scott Ritter as an example of political persecution in the United States.
Hey guys, so I'm on the way to the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum with an American delegation in order to promote and strengthen ties between Russia and the United States. But do you know who's not going? Former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer Scott Ritter. He's an American, and before he could come to Russia, he was detained on his flight and had his passport seized.
Honestly, can we just, if they want to deal with them, let them have them. Let them have, we get one less of these types on our streets, let them have them.
Now, does that sound like freedom to you? It's basically showing that anyone that
Does that sound like freedom to you? It says none of the details of the case, just that his passport was seized. Not why it was seized, not what he did, just that it was seized.
is pro-Russia or has any kind of good ties or relationship with Russia
Oh, I thought she was gonna say
is a threat to the United States, and they cannot have that. Now, Scott Ritter is a public persona, so obviously this was all over the news. But what if it happens to someone that isn't a public persona, who doesn't have a voice?
yeah, like one of those blue-collar kitty diddlers.
What then? It's showing Americans that even if you have not committed a crime, they can still
He did twice, possibly more.
take your freedom away, and they will. I am going with other Americans that live in Russia. We're trying to help the relationship between Russia and the United States.
Yeah, well, you're doing a pretty shit job. If you want to help, make them stop invading the country. How about that? I think that would probably be one of the quickest ways to improve the relationship.
We're going to network. We're going to talk with people from other countries. Maybe Scott Ritter was here to do the same. I don't know. But it's not fair.
Scott Ritter goes to Chechnya and makes like war speeches to the soldiers going to Ukraine to go butcher. Like, that's not building good relationships between the United States and Russia. That's being their dog.
That he had that taken away from him on the basis of nothing. This is why when people tell me that the United States is such a free and democratic country, well, come on. Anyways, guys, stay tuned.
Wow. Guys, we need to stand up for the real oppressed minority. Pedophiles. I mean, don't simp for a convicted pedophile. That would probably help the relation. I mean, yeah, it's like, is there no shame?